In today's video, what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about my photography equipment. I am not a professional at this at all. This is just sort of something I did while I'd be taking road trips in my car. And for the last 10 years, I've actually been using a fairly low-end camera. This particular one was a Nikon D3000. I purchased this, I think, in around 2009, and I used this pretty much just as a point-and-shoot camera. I was either using like just the auto mode, or there's this, it's like a landscape type preset on there. I basically used that for most of the pictures I took. Didn't really learn anything about photography, like the specifics about aperture and how ISO works and stuff like that. So, you know, some of the pictures that I took, I like them, but there wasn't anything overly special about them. I didn't really learn anything about how to do composition. So, yeah, I mean, this served its purpose for me, I think, for the most part. But I was looking to upgrade to something that would challenge me to learn more about photography, and I was looking to do a big tech upgrade, and yeah, I was wanting to replace the D3000 with something that would probably last me another 10 years. So I picked up the Nikon D7200. This is, well, I don't really have a whole lot of experience with other models of cameras, but I can say that I really do love this camera. Uh, when I bought this, it was earlier this year, so I think maybe March or April of 2019. The D7500 was already out. This was, I think, on sale. Well, the body only is what I picked up. This was on for about 899 Canadian dollars, I believe, whereas the D7500 was about 12.99. And the 7500 only seemed to offer a couple features that I didn't think I was ever going to use, so I figured I would save some money and stick with the 7200. And I haven't really used it extensively, but whenever I go on a trip with my car, or if I plan on doing like hiking trips, it is something that I force myself to haul with me, and yeah, I have had a lot of fun with it, because one of the reasons why I picked this camera over something simpler to use was I wanted something that would basically make me learn the specifics of photography, and not something that I would just leave in auto mode. And when I went and spent this much money on the camera, I don't like wasting money. So by spending this much on a camera, I was forcing myself to do it, because I wouldn't want to just spend, like upwards of $1,000 or more on a camera and lenses, and then not actually learn how to use it in a somewhat professional manner. So that's typically not what you should do, but that's just kind of the only way that I could motivate myself to learn photography. So, but yeah, it's been less than a year that I've owned this, but I think I've come a long way in learning how photography works and stuff like that. So I think today we'll just go over the hardware that I've got here, and look at some of the stuff that I've got on the camera, like the custom settings. And at the end of the video, I think we'll just go over some of what I consider some of my better pictures. Yeah, like I said, I'm not a professional. I think sometimes I just get lucky with some of my shots. So we'll take a look at those at the end of the video, though. Anyway, aside from the camera itself, the lens that I actually keep attached to my camera most of the time, like when I'm traveling with the camera in the bag, this is the Sigma 10-20 wide-angle lens. This I bought on the used market, and I think it was, what did I pay for it? About 350 Canadian dollars, I believe. And this is probably my favorite lens. the kind of pictures I prefer to take are mostly like nature and landscapes. So it would make sense that I would get a wide-angle lens for doing landscape photos. And this is the first wide-angle lens that I've owned, and yeah, I'm very impressed with the results I get from this lens. And the only other type of wide-angle lens I would consider is I think it's like the Tokina or something like that, the 11 to 16. That would have been my other choice if I didn't find the Sigma locally for a decent price. So yeah, I keep the Sigma lens on here pretty much all the time um, because most of the photography that I like to do does involve wide angle views. So around the same time that I bought the D7200, I also did pick up a couple prime lenses. We've got here is the 50 millimeter prime and the 35 millimeter. The 50 was the one I was intending to buy because I figured this would be a decent lens to use for certain types of nature shots and whatnot. And the 35 I picked up at the same time I bought the camera just because it was a cheap enough add-on item. I think this was less than $200 Canadian, if I'm not mistaken. So I figured that having the 35 and the 50 would make a good combination. And I actually do find myself using the 35 quite a bit more than the 50 if I'm doing trying to do fairly high quality, like very sharp images of nature. And I'll throw a few examples of that at the end of the video as well. But yeah, also I am using a crop sensor camera, so a 35 millimeter crop sensor lens is going to give you obviously different results from a full frame. But the difference is a full frame and crop sensor. That could be a whole other conversation. And basically, the reason I went with a crop sensor camera is, well, number one, I'm not a professional. I just consider myself to be an amateur photographer. So it wouldn't really make sense to spend twice the amount of money on the camera. But also, I wasn't willing to spend all that much money on all of my other lenses. So I didn't want to have the expensive pro lenses that were also a lot larger and heavier than ones like these that I built in my collection here. So yeah, it wouldn't make sense for me to go with a full frame camera. I do a lot of well, I try to do a lot of backpacking with my equipment, and yeah, it's from looking at the equipment available for full frame cameras, it would have been a lot more weight added to my bag. So crop sensor camera is, I'm sure, good enough for my needs. So other than that, I do have, this is an older lens. This was actually given to me by my dad a while back when he was, I think, upgrading his equipment. It's the Nikon 24 to 85. I've looked this up online. I do know it is a much older lens than I think the other ones I've got here. There's no like VR or anything like that, and it does require that the camera have the that autofocus motor, which my D3000 did not, but the 7200 is capable of autofocusing this lens. So that makes this, I don't know, I like the results from this. I don't think it's going to be as sharp as my prime lenses, obviously, but the range of this lens, I think, makes it a good, convenient lens to just do anything that might not fit within the realm of my other lenses. And this also it does have this macro ability, so haven't really tried this too much, but if I'm trying to get extremely close to a small object, yeah, I think if I move this within the red or the orange range here, flip this to macro, yeah, I've played this a little bit. Basically gets you real close to the subject. So that is something I will explore I'm sure in the future. But yeah, so I haul this lens with me most of the time when I take my camera out. This last lens, this is something that I didn't really need. It's a 55-200. This is obviously not going to be a pro version of a zoom lens, but as you can see, it's actually fairly compact. And that's why I bought this one. This was fairly cheap as well. I think this was like $100 Canadian, and for a brand new lens. I decided to buy this one because well, this would have been my only other lens capable of doing any amount of zoom, really. And I don't think I'm going to be using this lens all that much, but I did want to pick it up in case I'm out in the field somewhere and I did need a fairly large amount of zoom to pick up a subject. But I've played around with this a little bit. It's not exactly a lens I plan on using a whole lot. Usually I prefer the wide angle instead of trying to use a zoom lens. But yeah, I figured I couldn't go wrong with the price, so I added it to my collection. If we look at some of the accessories that I use, in my filter bag, let's take a look. I do have a couple ND filters. This is a 10-stop filter, and it's for the 82mm size, which is used by my Sigma wide-angle lens. I figured that using when I do long exposures, I find myself using the Sigma lens for that, so I picked up the ND filters specifically for that lens. This is not really anything special. It's just like a random cheap brand I found on Amazon, and it's not bad. Obviously, there's better results that you can get from better filters, but because I'm not a professional, I wasn't willing to spend upwards of $100 per filter when I'm just buying this on a whim to see if I can make half-decent pictures with it. But I ended up buying 2 of those. I figured I would try doing stacking with super long exposures, but I think what I probably should have done is kept one being the 10 stop and another one being like a 4 or 6 instead of another 10. But I'll play with that in the future, I'm sure. But the other type filter that I've gotten here, the circular polarizer. This one is Tiffin. I'm assuming this is at least a half-decent brand. Obviously, it's not the most expensive that was available, but it was one within the price range I was willing to pay. Again, this is an 82mm for the Sigma lens, but also buying the filter for your largest lens. If you really wanted to use this on one of the smaller lenses, you could just physically hold it in front of the lens as you take your picture. I didn't really expect I would ever be doing that, but it is an option instead of buying one of these for every size for all my other lenses. So yeah. The other thing that I find myself using pretty often, this is specifically for doing long exposure. This is basically just a shutter release thingy majig that is plugs into the camera. This was pretty cheap. I mean, it's like a $10 part or something like that. I didn't really care about going for wireless because that would mean obviously would be more expensive than this, and you'd have to have batteries and have to have the wireless enabled on your camera, and that would drain battery faster. So, you know, why not just plug this into your camera, don't have to put batteries in it, and whenever I'm doing a super long exposure where the exposure would be, let's say, beyond 30 seconds, which is I think the limit for what the camera does built in, then I just basically push the button, move this into the hold position, and then if I have a stopwatch open on my phone, I can use that to determine how long the photo or the exposure that I'm aiming for. Obviously, more expensive ones from this, you'd have like a little screen on there with a timer, but I didn't want to spend the money on that when I didn't know if I was going to be using it all that much. But yeah, whenever I'm doing like night photography or something like that, I use this. And another reason why I would use this is so my hand is not actually on the camera. So if I'm trying to avoid kind of having that shake by touching the camera and not having it stabilized by the time that the exposure starts, makes this kind of handy. But on that note, I think we're going to talk a little bit about the specifics of the 7200 that interest me. Before I dive into all of that, the camera does actually have this like self-timer feature where if you move this bottom ring over to this little timer icon, I think I've got it set to 2 or 4 seconds or something like that. So if I have the camera set up on a tripod and I dial this into the timer mode and then I push the shutter button, it actually waits like 2 seconds before it actually starts the exposure or starts taking the picture. So that's kind of an easy way if I'm taking a tripod shot in low light. I don't feel like having the remote shutter plugged in. That is helpful for making sure that I don't have camera shake from my hand ruining my picture. But other than that, I usually just keep it in this S mode, which is like the default mode that it's in all the time. So, in terms of the main camera mode, I find myself shooting in aperture priority mode most of the time. So that's the A. And sometimes I do find myself going in full manual mode, which is typically what I do in if I'm doing long exposures or low light, that sort of thing, then I'm shooting in manual. But if I'm taking a picture and there's daylight out, for the most part, I will be shooting in aperture priority. If we look at now, one thing that I've got here is this little clip that covers the view piece there. This blocks out light when you're doing long exposures. I keep this installed on the camera all the time. The reason being is I do a lot of shots that would require this to be in place, and I find myself using the live view if I'm taking a picture more than I'd be using this. I'll get into that in a couple of minutes, I think, but also one reason is the actual original piece that was on here. I lost that in the forest somewhere, apparently. I was going down a trail and I was setting up for a shot, and I realized that the original piece that was on here was just no longer there, and I figure it fell off the camera at some point, so that was mildly annoying. So I just keep this on there all the time, and if I ever find a need for looking through this piece, then I just remove it at that time. Usually I find myself looking through the small hole here if I'm doing anything that requires faster focus, because if you're using the live view, the focusing on your lens does go, well, noticeably, for me, noticeably slower than if you're not in live view. So if I'm using, let's say for example, if I'm trying to take a picture of a moving subject, it would make a lot more sense to have to be looking through here and get that faster focus. Other things about this camera, it's a dual SD card. The way I have my SD cards configured is for mirroring. These are 64 gigabyte cards that I use, so for me it's more than enough to hold all of my day's photos and then some. So I use mirroring because I don't trust technology, and one of the SD cards I originally bought was actually defective, and after you reached about 4 gigabytes it would just stop writing to it. And I didn't realize that until I was like using it in the camera. So yeah, I don't really trust the quality of a lot of modern technology. So by just mirroring the pictures on the cards, it protects me to some degree from failure of the SD cards in the field, where I would be most unhappy if I lost all of my pictures. So, yeah. One other important thing that I've done with the camera is set the back button focus. I didn't really think about how important this would be until I did it. This takes the autofocus off of your shutter button and moves it to this button here. And you might think, well, I mean, that kind of seems silly because then you have to push this button over here and then you have to push this button to take your photo. But it's actually very useful because in the kind of pictures that I take, I find myself very rarely needing to focus between the shots that I take. So usually if I'm taking a landscape shot or something like that, my focus is, well, unless I've got a subject that's really close by, my focus is probably always going to be around the same distance. So if I'm taking multiple photos of the same thing, and I'm just dialing my settings a little differently for like experimentation, my focus won't be changing, and I don't want to have the camera try to refocus every time I take a new shot. So if I'm lining up my shot, I hold down this button to dial in the focus, and then I can just take as many pictures as I want and not have to worry about it accidentally focusing on something else that I don't want. This is also fairly handy for doing my night photography, because when it's dark out in the middle of the night, your camera probably won't be focusing on all that much of anything unless you have a well-lit subject. So I find myself dialing in some of my focus manually, depending on what lens that I'm using. Some of the pictures that I take at night are using the Sigma lens that I've got on here right now, and this does have the manual focus ring. So instead of having to switch the lens into manual focus all the time for doing night shots, yeah, I just manually set what I think the focus should be, and then I just continue with taking the pictures, and then I adjust as needed. Because if your camera can't see the subject well lit, then it won't really focus on it. So yeah, it wouldn't make sense to have the camera trying to look for a subject if it's pitch black out. So. But that's just my experience. Yeah, I'm not a professional at this. I'm just kind of teaching myself as I go. So if we look at some of the settings that I've got, well, I've already mentioned the back button focus. There's really not much else that I've changed. If I look at, let's see. My custom menus, yeah, most of this I haven't really changed at all. For autofocus, right now I've got it set to 11 focus points, although I'm not too sure. I think I originally had it as 51. I don't know, I'm just kind of playing around with different settings as I go, but for the most part, all of this stuff is the original stock settings. One thing that I do have that I've done recently, so if we get out of the menu, I've assigned my function button down here. So if I push that, it'll bring up the My Menu thing. And I've done this because I'm going to try adding some settings in here that I might want to change while I'm trying to line up a shot. One being the exposure delay mode. This is something that I only read about today. It's the vibration of your mirror moving that potentially could cause, I guess, your image to not be completely sharp if you're doing a photo in like lower light where your shutter is going to be, I guess, open for a bit longer than like in the middle of the day. So this setting you can actually change it to have like a multiple second delay where like the movement from your mirror would kind of well, any vibration ideally would have settled before the camera actually takes the exposure or something like that. And yeah, I didn't read about this until earlier today, so I've set that in the My Menu area. So when I'm in the field and I've forgotten everything about this camera, I can jump into here and then suddenly remember, oh yeah, there was a setting I was going to try out, and that'll be one of them. So yeah, other than that, most of my options are pretty much the default. I was mentioning before about doing a lot of my shooting now in live view, and one reason that that happens to be the case for me is, well, one thing we've got here, you can actually get a grid set up. This can help if you're not really that good at composition and you've heard of things like the rule of thirds, where you don't necessarily want your subject to be like straight in the middle of the shot. You need it to be kind of like in certain quadrants, if I'm explaining this properly. So having a grid on your screen can help you visualize that, because composition is something I've traditionally not really been good at, and I still struggle with it. So yeah, this might help for me trying to frame a picture properly. But one of the things I use all the time is this handy feature, which tells you if your camera is level or not. One strange problem that I've had with a lot of my landscape photos before I was using live view is when I'd get back to my computer to do the editing, I'd find that my pictures were always tilted slightly. And even though when I'm in the field and I'm taking my picture, I have a voice in the back of my head saying, make sure your picture is level. And it looks completely level to me. And then I get back on the computer and then I bring up my grid in my editing program, and I've noticed that my, like, basically the horizon is not level and it's noticeable. And it kept happening to me. And then I kind of looked at the manual for this camera and I was like, oh, maybe I should use the live view. And then this thing will tell me if my picture is level or not. So yeah. Another nice thing about the live view is you can kind of use your arrow key to move the little box that it uses to focus. So you can actually tell the camera what you want to focus on by moving the box, and then I hold down my focus button, and then boom, there, it's focused. When I'm using the old eyepiece thing there, and if I'm trying to focus on something, the camera seems to decide what it wants to focus on. And I think for the most part, that is acceptable. If you've got a subject that is clearly what you're trying to photograph, the camera will, I think for the most part, realize that and focus on that. Sometimes, though, you might have the camera focus on something else that just happens to be in view, and you don't want that. So you have to, like, I don't know, I find myself like moving the camera around, trying to focus on multiple things until it gets to the proper focus point for what I'm trying to reach. I don't know. That might just be confusion of the camera, but I find that, yeah, doing this and being able to dial in your actual focus subject is pretty handy. And oh, one other feature that I think you have to change in your custom settings, you can change the OK button to automatically zoom 100%. And this is also very helpful if you're like when you're trying to dial in your focus. So if you're trying to find your focus, you can use a little box, move it to where you think you're trying to focus, and then you hit the OK button, you've zoomed in 100% and then try to focus. And this way you can see completely if you've got your focus set up, or if it looks out of focus, that means the camera has in fact focused on something else. And yeah, so because I mean, there's only so much that you can see from this tiny screen, and pictures that might look decent on here might look a whole lot different by the time you get home and do your editing. So yeah, that's just kind of one of the tips that I found on a whole lot of like Nikon videos that people have put out for just helpful tips and tricks for these cameras. So, but yeah, I don't find myself using it too often. If I'm doing a large landscape, then chances are my focus is going to be like almost at infinity, so it's not really a big deal anyway. But it is just one of those things that you should know about your camera. So yeah. So the last couple items that I've got here, this is the tripod that I use. K&F Concept. Nothing really special about this. This was, I think, one of the cheaper tripods that had like this kind of quick release type head to it, because I don't really like having to screw the camera in all the time. I mean, obviously you do screw this part, but yeah, I find this to be decently convenient. But one of the things I was looking for is a fairly light tripod, because I'm trying to do a bunch of backpacking and I didn't really want to carry a heavy tripod with me. And this does seem fairly lightweight. I don't even know how much it weighs, but yeah, I don't have any complaints over this tripod. Yeah. And when I'm going out and trying to do nature shots, I probably have my camera in this bag here. This is like, I don't know if it's like a no-name thing. It's got this thing on here. I don't know, just kind of says Eve case or something like that. I have no idea. This is a bag that I picked up on Amazon. Typically, I don't really like buying things on Amazon, but I wanted to try and find a bag that would hold my camera and not be overly expensive. And this is what I ended up with. In your top compartment here, gives me enough room for the camera as well as my lenses, and then anything else, my accessories, I can just kind of shove in these compartments here. Down here I do also have more like survival equipment, so I got like bear spray down in here because I don't want to get killed by a bear. I do live in Canada, so I haven't actually come across bears that often, but yeah, I always go prepared. I don't really have any complaints about this bag. I do find that having all the equipment in the upper half of the bag does make it a little top heavy. Honestly, I think I'd prefer if all of the weight was at the bottom. But, I don't think I paid more than maybe like $60 or $70 for this thing. So it's, the quality for the price is acceptable to me. Before this, I had a smaller backpack, and what I would do is I would take my camera and sometimes just have it wrapped up in like a sweater sitting inside the backpack, or if I was taking all of my lenses with me, I would have my smaller camera bag with all the camera stuff in it shoved into the backpack, usually at the bottom below all the water bottles and stuff, and getting at the camera would take a significant amount of time, whereas this thing basically just unzip the lid, grab your camera out, switch your lens if necessary, and then zip it back up after. So for a convenience standpoint, I do like this bag. It's not a full backpack that you'd use for like overnight trips. You could probably strap enough stuff to it if you really had to. But I will be looking for an even larger bag that will then hold a sleeping bag, a tent, and food and all that stuff. But for like one single day, like if you're doing a day trip, I find this will pretty much hold anything I need. So yeah. Anyway, I think let's get on to some of my sample pictures. So we're going to take a look at some of the pictures I've taken from my Nikon D7200. Starting off with the first picture here, this was taken with my Sigma wide-angle lens. This is the kind of photo I imagined I would be taking pretty often. It's like nature landscape. So having the wide-angle lens definitely was nice on this picture. Yeah, not much else to say about this. I just figured it was a nice looking view from where I happened to be at that particular time. Moving on to the second photo here. This is something that I didn't really have too much experience with. It was trying to do sunsets. Most of the pictures I'd previously taken on my other camera were daytime pictures, and I'd never really tried to time my photos to end up with like interesting looking skies or anything like that. So this is another picture that I took with my Sigma wide angle lens, and I was trying to capture something other than a daytime sky. And I think this was right around sunset. So this is something I intend on trying more of in the future. Moving on, we've got this picture here. There wasn't really anything that was too special about this. What I was doing was I was walking down a trail, and the only lens that I had with me on my camera was the 35 millimeter. The rest of my gear was still in my car. I think I was just trying to reach the beach for a lake around Revelstoke, and I looked down, and there was a small plant that had light hitting it right at that particular moment. So I just had the 35 mil lens dialed into f1.8 and took that picture, and then continued walking. And it actually turned out better than I thought it would for something that I put zero thought into. So that was kind of neat. Next picture here. This is something that I just happened to stumble across while I was hiking to another location. Basically, I just noticed this flower, and there was, I guess, looks like a bee in there at that particular moment as I was walking past it. And this was another picture with the 35 millimeter lens, and it's been cropped to this. So the actual picture was larger than this, but the lens does produce very sharp results. So I was able to crop this in to get this shot. And it still has a lot of detail, and I'm actually quite surprised about the quality of that. But so this sort of nature shot is one of the things I hope to work a bit more on, and that leads us into the next picture. This was actually on a 50 millimeter lens. This is off of a trail in Manning Park. I was heading down to take a different type of picture. Those didn't work out very well, but on my way back, this was evening light that happened to be hitting some of these fairly colorful looking plants, and I happened to notice a bee that was going between the plants. So I managed to get the camera out of my bag and get a picture of this bee on the plant. And he was moving pretty quick, so it took a few shots to get this good look where the bee was actually in focus as well. So, but yeah, it's I like the color of this shot. So yeah, it's one of my favorites. If we move on to this is another type of picture that I'd like to do more of. It's finding like old buildings and farm type shots. I don't really know what my fascination is with this sort of stuff, but like abandoned buildings and farms, like rural type areas, I'd like to get more pictures of that sort of stuff. So this was actually, I was driving down the highway coming back from
Uh, I don't remember where it was, but it was in the evening, and I was driving back from a place I was doing some hiking at, and I had driven past this barn, maybe like 20 times, and I glanced over at it, and like the light seemed to be working pretty good for it right at that moment. So I found somewhere to turn around and pull over, and it's on private property, so this is pretty much the only view I could get of the barn. So, yeah, took that picture. That was on I think it was with a 35 millimeter lens, and I don't know. I think it looks neat. So, if we move on to, I got two more photos here. The first one, this is a one of my experiments with doing long exposure at night. So what I did is I drove out to the city of Kamloops, and I found a spot off of Highway 5 that had a good view of the city and also had the highway in frame. And then I took a long exposure shot. This was, I think this was probably around 30 seconds or more. And I captured the streaks of light from some passing vehicles in there. And that was just kind of one of my first experiment shots with long exposure. So I'd like to try more of that in the future. But that does bring us to the last picture. This is a picture I actually took last night. It's getting close to winter in my region, and I was taking my car out for one of the last rips on the highway before all the highways get covered in snow and whatnot. So, yeah, I was up around the Trans-Canada Highway area, and I pulled over to a side road that runs parallel to the actual highway. And I had my car sitting kind of in the middle of the road. This was around 1 o'clock in the morning, so there was no traffic on this side road. And there were a few trucks going by on the main highway, but I did actually have to kind of stand there and wait for one. And then I started my long exposure to capture that's those streaks of light there. Um, I would like to try this sort of shot when there's more traffic, so earlier on in the evening. But that might limit the number of spots that I can just stop at, and I don't know. But having my car in this shot, I wasn't planning on trying that, but I think this particular shot, I think it turned out kind of interesting the way it all looks, and it was actually a very foggy night as well, so you have that look in the photo as well. So, but yeah, these are just kind of the types of photos that I like to take, and I hope to kind of get better at this and learn more about doing composition, learn more about editing photos properly, and yeah, we'll see where it takes me.